Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cracking open a seriously fascinating forensic dossier. We're investigating a deeply contested period in modern history. But, we aren't looking at the military tactics of 1984 in Punjab. Actually, scratch that. We're examining something equally powerful, but way more hidden. We're looking at the bureaucratic paper trail. Based on detailed source material from the Death Certificate Project, we're going to explore how administrative architecture can literally be weaponized during state operations. It is a completely gripping look at how paperwork, or more accurately, the deliberate absence of it, shapes history.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll be methodically unpacking this complex historical argument in 6 quick steps. First, the evidentiary framework. Second, the unbroken district front. Third, the administrative churn. Fourth, the decisive June transition. Fifth, the missing statutory records. And finally, the bureaucratic aftermath. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The evidentiary framework.
Before we get into the heavy stuff, we kind of need to understand how our source material actually classifies its evidence, right? It's super interesting because the archive doesn't just throw a monolith of facts at you, it meticulously grades them into 3 distinct tiers. You've got proved findings, so that's your court judgments and official records, then documented allegations, which covers witness testimonies and press archives, and finally analytical inferences, which are these really well-reasoned structural arguments. This framework is awesome because it lets us neutrally examine official government admissions right alongside structural analysis without mixing them up.
Section 2. The unbroken district front.
So, the source points out a massive legal roadblock. Before any military operation could kick off at the Darbar Sahib, the central government hit a wall with the local civil administration. The law here was crystal clear. Even under an emergency, the military absolutely couldn't just roll into a civil space on its own. Under the constitutional framework, specifically the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and the Code of Criminal Procedure, they needed a formal requisition. They literally needed the explicit physical signature of the local district magistrate to authorize the deployment. It's the ultimate civilian safeguard.
But here's where things get really intense. The archive details that Deputy Commissioner Gurdev Singh Brar and the Senior Superintendent of Police, Ajay Pal Singh Mann, flat out refused to bypass the law. Brar just wouldn't sign the military authorization. Together, these 2 officers formed what the source calls an unbroken front. They insisted on strict legal procedure and totally resisted the informal pressure coming from the top. So, according to the dossier, for New Delhi to push its military plans forward, it desperately needed a bureaucratic backdoor. They had to somehow break this local resistance.
Section 3. The administrative churn. So the million-dollar question, how do you remove a legal obstacle when the officers are literally just following the law? Well, if we look at the timeline of appointments leading up to the event, the sheer velocity is mind-boggling. The source argues the government kicked off an administrative churn. In just 4 years, Amritsar cycled through 6 different SSPs, and the state went through 6 governors. It's a revolving door. And get this, in February 1984, the UK SAS was consulted on assault plans, and the very next month, SSP Man, the guy standing in the way, was suddenly replaced. The text argues that this was no accident. This administrative volatility, it was a calculated, strategic instrument. Think of it as a methodical purge of institutional conscience. By constantly rotating officials in and out, the state made sure no one could build enough local authority to push back, completely softening the ground for what was about to happen.
Section 4. The decisive June transition. This brings us to the days immediately before the June 1984 assault, and there is a really stark contrast here in how officials were handled. Gurdev Singh Brar, the guy who refused to sign the order, was suddenly sent on compulsory leave right in the middle of a historic crisis. He received 0 state honors. On the flip side, you have Ramesh Inder Singh. He's a junior officer, no prior district command experience, and he is suddenly installed on June 4th, literally as the operation is peaking. He complies with the state and is later rewarded with the Padma Shri, one of India's absolute highest civilian honors. The analytical inference here is pretty clear. Compliance equaled career advancement, while constitutional resistance got you removed.
With a new compliant officer plugged into the system, the fallout was immediate. The archive maps out how, on June 3rd, the curfew was relaxed, which allowed thousands of pilgrims to pour into the complex for a sacred religious anniversary. And then, the trap just snapped shut. Utilities were completely severed, pilgrims were suddenly trapped in the blistering June heat without water. And the newly installed civil administration, they issued absolutely 0 public warnings. They also denied curfew passes to journalists, plunging the whole area into a strict media blackout. Oh, and that official requisition for the army we talked about? It didn't even come from Amritsar in the end. The Secretariat in Chandigarh entirely bypassed the local magistrate to authorize the deployment.
Section 5. The missing statutory records.
We are now at the core legal tragedy of this dossier, and it's all about what happened after the guns fell silent. Normally, government paperwork is just annoying red tape, right? But here, the absence of that mundane paperwork is horrifying. Under the Indian Code of Criminal Procedure, the Deputy Commissioner is legally bound to follow strict steps for every single unnatural death. You need an inquest report, a magisterial inquiry, individual identification with a post-mortem, and finally a death certificate. These aren't just polite suggestions. They are the mandatory, statutory mechanisms that keep a state accountable.
But according to the source, the civil bureaucratic machinery just shut down. None of those legal reports were ever generated. Instead, the military bypassed the civil administration entirely and handled body disposal themselves. The dossier outlines some incredibly dark details. Municipal workers allegedly paid with looted belongings, and bodies literally transported in garbage trucks to be burned in mass heaps. The big argument here is that the civil administration didn't even need to order this to happen. Their sheer silence, their refusal to generate the required paperwork, legally enabled the entire cover-up.
To put the human cost of this administrative void into perspective, the archive points to 55 men. 55 men who suffocated to death in a locked room during the intense heat of the operation. Because the statutory machinery was completely disengaged, not a single death certificate was ever issued for them. It's like they just vanished from the legal record.
And the scale gets so much bigger. 2,097. That is the number of illegal cremations the Central Bureau of Investigation later identified in the Amritsar district alone. The source makes the case that this staggering number was the direct, scaled-up result of that engineered paperless regime established back in June.
Section 6. The Bureaucratic Aftermath.
So how did the state manage the fallout in the years that followed? Well, the dossier argues this blueprint of paperless state action didn't stop. It expanded. It morphed into Operation Woodrose, leading to mass, totally unrecorded detentions of Sikh men across rural villages. No individualized legal detention orders were processed by the DC's office. And alongside this human toll, there was a devastating cultural one. The Sikh Reference Library, which housed 20,000 priceless historical manuscripts, was confiscated by the CBI. Then, days after the fighting had completely stopped, the building was allegedly burned down. It seems the goal was to destroy the historical record itself.
Now bringing it back to Ramesh Inder Singh, the officer who took over on June 4th. According to the analysis, the state evaluated his administration during this exact window of mass unrecorded cremations and detentions, and they explicitly rewarded him with the Padma Shri. And the stated reason? For his contributions to public administration.
Honestly, this next part is a structural twist you couldn't even make up. Years later, Singh retires early to become Punjab's Chief Information Commissioner. Think about what that means. That role made him the final appellate authority for right-to-information disputes. He was literally acting as the gatekeeper to the archives. Families who were desperately seeking answers, seeking the very death certificates his office failed to issue in 1984, were forced to submit their appeals to the exact man who architected the missing paper trail in the first place.
Which brings us to the dossier's ultimate, chilling analytical inference. It boils down to this realization. A massacre requires soldiers, for sure, but an official massacre, that requires paperwork. The true weapon used here wasn't just military might. It was the strategic, highly deliberate withholding of civil paperwork.
I think this quote from the source material just perfectly hits the nail on the head. The district had a magistrate, the dead had none. It completely encapsulates the tragic failure of statutory duty. The administrative architecture was weaponized, simply by stepping aside and staying completely silent.
So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. When the bureaucratic architecture of a state is weaponized through silence and through the deliberate absence of records, how can a community ever truly reclaim its history? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, always look at the structure behind the story, and we'll see you next time.